Shalom lekulam. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this latest edition of the Begin Center's English programming. For those of you that are new to what we're doing here, we have every Wednesday evening a lecture or discussion in English. We've been doing this since pretty much since May, since Israel returned from its first lockdown. And obviously we found that, like everywhere else, the Begin Center was not able to host events as it was previously doing. So we have a very full Zoom schedule, and Wednesday we have events in English. If you'd like to see some of the things we've done in the past, you can go to our YouTube channel and Begin Center on YouTube, and you'll see a whole bunch of lectures and discussions around Israeli politics, Israeli history, Zionism, Jewish issues. We have authors who've released new books, discussions with them, sort of Zoom book launches, so to speak. And we've had a number of lecture series where we take particular topics and we look from different perspectives from over three or four different speakers over several weeks, and we're starting that today with a new series basically inspired by a speech that President Ruvi Rivlin gave in 2015. We're coming to the end of President Rivlin's term as president. I think he steps down in July, and really amongst the many very important and influential things that he said in his nearly now 7 years as president, was a speech that he gave in which he referred to 4 tribes in Israel. He was speaking from a place of concern, shall we say, that the Israel that he wanted to see, that he thought had existed in the past, was sort of splitting apart into these 4 tribes, which he identified as secular, national religious, ultra-orthodox, Kharidi, and Arab. And he called for some sort of action to unify those 4 tribes, not of course to unify them in that they would all start agreeing with each other and behaving in the same way, but that they would overcome the tensions between them. So we're very happy to be able to kick off this series with a look at what President Rivlin defined as secular Jews. I think with all of these discussions and lectures, I'm going to have to add the following qualification, which is that I think by necessity, President Rivlin was simplifying things by splitting up into these four tribes, because of course in all 4 cases they're not monolithic, and there's a lot of diversity within those 4, and perhaps secular above all, because by secular what he was really saying, I think, was people who are not ultra-orthodox and are not national religious, and of course not Arab. And in that group, there is obviously people that are not just, that wouldn't necessarily define themselves as secular. Some may define themselves as traditional, which maybe we'll get onto with our speaker. And also, of course, people that a minority, but certainly some who would define themselves denominationally in the way that diaspora Jews tend to. People who are active in, say, reform and conservative movements, which exist in Israel, but obviously are much smaller than they are outside of Israel. So we're going to discuss this with our guest today, and we're very happy to welcome Uri Keidar, who is the executive director of Israel Hofsheet, Be Free Israel, the English translation, which is the largest grassroots and advocacy movement in Israel in the field of religious freedom and Jewish pluralism. Prior to this role, he spent over 7 years in leading positions in civil society organizations and politics, both in elected and professional positions. He grew up in Kibbutz Givat Brenner, where he now lives with his wife, which I've only discovered this evening from him, is near Rehovot, for those that don't know. He lives there with his wife and their daughter. He has a BA in political science and communications from Ben Gurion University of the Negev, where he served as the elected chairperson of the student union. He completed his military service as a tank commander in the IDF's Armored Corps, where he still serves in active reserve duty. And we're very happy to have him with us. Uri, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good evening or good morning to wherever I found you in these weird times. And I'm very happy to be here. And I think that it's a very interesting topic to discuss. And I hope that this conversation will be a good kickstart to
Great. Thank you. Yeah, we definitely have a lot of time zones represented here. So for some people, it's evening, and others afternoon or even late morning. What I want to do, Uri, is to just read a short extract from President Rivlin's speech, just to sort of get people in the sort of thinking that where we're starting from this. And I would also recommend people they can probably find, I suspect the whole speech in English translation is available online if you Google it. But this is an extract, obviously translated into English. So he says, and he lists here 4 cities or towns in Israel which are easily identified by Israelis as representing either secular Arab, national religious, or ultra-orthodox. He says a child from Beit El, a child from Rahat, a child from Herzliya, and a child from Beitar Illit. Not only do they not meet each other, but they are educated toward a totally different outlook regarding the basic values and desired character of the state of Israel. He then goes on to speak of mutual ignorance and lack of a common language, which he says increases the tension, fear, hostility, and competitiveness between these 4 tribes. He calls it a new Israeli order. And he says that this order now requires us to abandon the accepted view of majority and minorities and move to a new concept of partnership between the various population sectors in our society. Uri, can you start by telling us a little bit about the organization that you run, Israel Hofsheet, Be Free Israel, and maybe how the problems that it was created to deal with, that it was created to confront, how they're related to this idea of a divided Israel that President Rivlin sets out.
Definitely. So Israel Hofsheet, as you said, is the biggest grassroots and advocacy movement in the field of religion and state. This has many names, okay? So even when I'm saying religion and state, as you said, we sometimes call it Jewish pluralism. We can call it in other names. And I think that it's very important, and I think it will also be important throughout the conversation to have definitions and to call things with their names and then tell them. Because I do think that we're in a field in which a lot of things has a lot of names, and sometimes we use different names for different things. So what do we call religion and state? Usually, I think when I'm trying to sort of knock the audience off and tell them something that they didn't think about, the best example that I use for Israeli issues of religion and state is women serving in combat units in the IDF. It's not the first thing that comes to mind, mainly to non-Israeli audiences. But I think that in Israel, when we're talking about do women serve in the IDF in all its units, including combat units, you see a divide. You see a divide that pretty much goes along the line of people who will, as you said, probably will define themselves as either secular or traditional. And that part, which is a huge part of the Israeli public, we will get to numbers later, will definitely support. We're talking about an ongoing discussion, by the way, that is existing in the Israeli society since 1994 in a formal way, the Alice Miller Supreme Court appeal. Alice Miller was the first woman who appealed and asked to be able to apply to the Israeli fighter pilot course. She won. She did not become the first fighter pilot, but she did a huge service, I think, to all of us. Of course, there are more obvious issues that come to mind: civil marriage, public transportation on Shabbat, the public sphere on Shabbat in general, issues that has to do with how do we, if I'm going sort of to a broader level, how do we define the Jewish and democratic character of the country, I think is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about religion and state. And the Jewish and democratic character of Israel, sometimes people call it a balance. I don't like that. I don't think that when you're trying to balance two things, it means that you imply that they contradict. I do not think that Jewish and democratic contradict, and I do not think that I should balance them, mainly because I think that a lot of time when people are saying Jewish here in Israel and also in other places, they will refer to a very specific portion of Orthodox. And I don't want to sound rude, but a lot of times when I'm talking to people, I tell them that when I try to explain how do I define the Jewish and democratic character of the country, if I'm starting with Jewish, I start with Forrest Gump. His mom tells him, he comes back at some point in the movie, he was called stupid, and his mom tells him stupid is who stupid does. And I'm saying that because I think that Jewish is what Jewish does, and what Jews do. And that is something that is changing, and it's changing a lot, and it's changing a lot in Israel, and it's changing a lot throughout the world. So sort of narrowing down Jewish to a very narrow definition is something that I don't like to do. And that's what also why I do not do the balancing part of it. So we also touch on issues of LGBTQ equality. We touch on issues of gender separation in the public sphere. You will find us fighting religious coercion. You will find us fighting for Israeli Russian-speaking Jews. And that overall picture is a very broad one. And we try to keep it broad, but we also try to keep it simple. And when I'm talking about all those issues, as you mentioned, we are an advocacy organization. We're pushing to promote different policies. We're doing that on a national level. We're also doing that on a local level with municipalities. That's something that, by the way, usually an American audience is much more aware of than Israelis. Here it's a very new phenomena that different cities apply different policies. The biggest shift that we have seen in the, I think, more than the last decade came last year when quite a few rather big municipalities decided to run their own buses on Shabbat programs. And it just became a thing. And for us as in Israel Hofsheet, it proved the point that we were trying to make for a while, that municipalities here have the power that they did not assume up until recently, but they have the power to change the reality.
And based on the populations of those places, right? So talking about places that are largely or exclusively secular cities, and therefore it doesn't make sense, according to the wishes of those people, it doesn't make sense to not have transport on Shabbat.
Definitely. And I think it's also important to note that in Israel, there aren't a lot of cities in which there is a religious majority. You have quite a few ultra-orthodox cities, Bnei Brak or Elad or Beitar Illit or Modi'in Illit. I don't care about buses on Shabbat in those places. I think that it's not something that we promote. We understand that if you're an ultra-orthodox city, buses will not run on Shabbat, and I'm fine with that. But throughout the country, usually we're talking about a policy that enjoys something around 70% of support, and the number is growing. That's, by the way, also the case for civil marriage. Issues that once were a niche topic in the Israeli public discussion are now gaining a lot of weight. And for us as an organization, this is sort of the main issue that we do. I have quite a few other issues that we touch on. We marry couples outside of the Rabbanut when you are allowed to hold weddings, which is not the case now. But on a normal time that hopefully will come back soon, we do more than 500 couples. We perform their weddings every year. We also give them legal advice on how to assume their rights as common law married couples in Israel. I will say, and maybe I should have started, there is no option for civil marriage in Israel within the country. That's a very, very, very broad discussion that I'm not sure we will have enough time to cover everything now. But that's a major topic that we do. We also have a training center for activists, and we also work a lot with, as I said, Russian-speaking Israelis, which is, by the way, another thing that is not really included in the tribe's speech, but we can get to that later.
Okay, and from what from what you've said, it seems to me that the major challenges, and perhaps this may be similar or different to the other three tribes, but for secular Israeli Jews, it seems that most of the challenges are challenges that they face because the state itself is not catering to their needs, right? So even though they represent a very large portion of the population, and you can tell us numbers in a minute, even though they represent that, and even though actually the vast majority of government ministers in this government and all previous governments are secular, the state has not leaned towards those secular requirements regarding things like marriage and religious pluralism, buses on Shabbat, transport on Shabbat, etc. Is that right from your perspective?
Unfortunately, the analysis is good. The problem is not the analysis, it's the reality. I will say that we are talking about a situation in which secular Israelis depends on how do you count them. But in demographic discussions, I like to use official data. Because then I'm not getting but it's biased, and who believes the polls now? The polls are always wrong. So let's talk about official governmental statistics. In 2018, when we were talking about Israeli Jews, the Central Bureau of Statistics found that Israeli Jews who define themselves as seculars is 43% of the Jewish population. That's the biggest group in Israel by far. Among Jews, and not only among Jews. The Central Bureau of Statistics, usually when you're a Jew and when they're asking for self-definition, they will give you 5 options, okay? So as I said, one is secular. The second one is traditional, not so religious. It sounds even worse in Hebrew. The third one is traditional religious. The fourth is religious, and the fifth is ultra-orthodox. I will say that broadly speaking, when you're talking about the difference between someone saying, I am secular or I am traditional but not religious, you will find out if they are Ashkenazi or Mizrahi. Okay, that's usually a very simple thing to understand. Ashkenazi people will usually tell you, I am secular. Mizrahi people will say, I'm traditional but not religious. You see that both those groups, who add up together to something around 65-66% of the Israeli Jewish public, again from official statistics, will usually align pretty much exactly the same when you're talking about issues. You will not find a major gap in, would you approve of civil marriage? Would you approve of public consultation on Shabbat? You will find a gap in self-definition, which I think is not hugely important in this category. But as I said, we're talking about a huge group, a very big one, that I would say, first of all, politically just does not act as a group. And I will say that I think that that's not a problem. That's not the only problem. I am secular. And I live in a kibbutz, and I did this and that in the army, and I work in Israel Hofsheet. We are all complicated people, and I don't think that people are only secular, and I also don't think that secular people should look up only for secular people's rights. That's just not. Don't think that that's a complete ideological term. But what we are seeing is that there's in a lot of times, and maybe I will surprise some of our guests here, you will hear people pointing fingers at the ultra-orthodox parties and saying they are holding everyone else hostage, they have a veto right because of. I think that, and again, I hope I won't offend anyone, American Jews specifically have a very good acquaintance with minority groups organizing as a minority group and working politically as a minority group. And I think that that's just fine for a minority group. I have no one in my kibbutz, or at least I'm not aware of, voted for an ultra-orthodox party. They're not my agents. I don't see them, and I don't have any expectations of them. They represent a minority. Fine, good for them. Really, I'm not cynical about this. I think that they are very good public representatives of the public who actually elects them. With that being said, they are a small minority. The people who cater to their political needs are not the people who identify totally with their beliefs. And I believe that the responsibility here lies on the shoulders of the majority to actually prevail with the policies that the majority supports, and not be in a constant ranting mode of, yeah, but what can we do, the ultra-orthodox, which is something that you constantly hear in Israeli politics. I have nothing to say about it. I just do not expect them. I haven't met neither a politician nor a political group that gave up power willingly. I'm not familiar with that. And maybe I'm wrong, but I am not familiar with that. So I don't think that we should expect the ultra-Orthodox to prevail the liberal parts of the country. But we as liberals have the responsibility to actually do that. And I think we're, in some points, getting better at that. I think we did a great job on public opinion. And now we need to do the same with policy.
Okay. I mean, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about how Americans will understand the concept of minority groups organizing, one difference, of course, is that here, because of the political system, a minority party or minority parties can hold the balance of power because of the coalition system that we have, and perhaps, without getting too much into some sort of political science conversation, perhaps in a system like America, a minority group has to sort of compromise in order to be part of that big tent called, let's say, the Democratic Party, in a way that ultra-orthodox parties here don't have to, and they can just make their demands, and then the major party, the Likud or whoever it happens to be, will decide to, they need them in order to form the coalition, and therefore they have outsized power beyond their numbers because of that.
I think that that's right to a point, because I also think that our politics is changing. We're seeing in front of our eyes changing, and that's really outside of the realm of what we're talking about. I think that we're seeing a very important change in how Arab politicians are being looked at.
Right.
And I think that will change Israeli politics in the near future. But again, I totally agree with what you said. I just think that it doesn't make sense. And I'm saying that because that's a lot of times what I hear from my colleagues and from my audience and from my constituency, so to say. They're to blame. They're not to blame. That's just not the case. I don't think that as an activist, I should be pointing fingers as to other groups and saying they are blocking my way to whatever. They are doing their thing. Again, as people who are trying to change reality, to blame the reality for not changing is not a very good strategic plan.
Okay, yeah, I hear that. That makes sense. I want to just say to everyone. So I'm gonna ask another question or two, and then I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions by writing them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. So you can start doing that from now until the end of the session. I'm also writing in the chat my name, Paul Gross, and my email address, because I'm aware that there are people on this call who are on this meeting who are new to this and may want to hear about other things that we do. And so by all means, email me and I will add you to my mailing list. Okay, Uri, let me ask you to go back to sort of where we started with Ruvi Rivlin's speech. Can you say something about how you, and I appreciate that obviously you cannot possibly represent all the secular or other
I'm not even trying.
Traditional but not religious Jews in Israel any more than our speaker next week, who is from the Kharidi community, ultra-orthodox community, will represent all of ultra-orthodox Jews. If you can just say from your perspective how you think secular Jews relate, for better or worse, with the other three groups, with national religious, ultra-Orthodox, and Arabs.
Okay. I will say that for better or for worse, secular communities in Israel viewed themselves as I said, as a majority group. By the way, we are seeing in recent years people who are starting to have some kind of an analysis saying that secular people should sort of ask for minority rights, because we're no longer such a huge majority as we used to be. I beg to differ. I think that when you're the biggest group in the country, you cannot ask for minority rights, but that's a different political discussion. I don't think that that's a great definition, but I'll start by saying what it's not. A secular Israeli usually is not very similar to what I met when going to the States was still possible, secular American Jews. And I'm saying that because it's very important, I think, to understand that we are talking about very different societies. So denominational Judaism is something that is different here. A lot of times people are asking me when I'm talking about it, say, okay, so if you would have lived in the States, you would have been a Reformed Jew. And my answer is, I don't know. I haven't tried that version of myself. And an Israeli Jew, I will say that will probably be practicing Jewish phenomena or life cycle events or holidays or just mitzvot, what we used to call, in a much broader sense that you can even imagine. We live in a Jewish majority country. Next week, we will have Chanukiot around the streets. I'm not sure if we will be able to walk the streets. That's a different problem. But we will have Chanukiot all over the country. It's very hard to find bread here unless you live near to an Arab town in Passover. A lot of the things that American Jews work for, and they need to be practicing some form of Judaism to do that. Here, what I usually like to quote Shmuel Rosner and Camille Fuchs, who I very, very, very much recommend their book called Israeli Judaism. I think that gives the best overview of our field. I will write in the chat later if I'll remember.
He's been on this program.
Shmuel,
yeah,
he's fantastic.
He's excellent.
And I will say that he refers to it in something that people might be offended by, but he's saying that you can be a lazy Jew in Israel and still be very Jewish. Right. And that's just the case. It's just a fact. You live in a country in which no one drives around in Yom Kippur, and people will usually have he gave a great example. I think he was talking about Passover, saying that like 98% of Jews have a Passover Seder. That means that in order not to have a Passover Seder, you need to really work in not having it. You unless you just sit at home, again, which is something that we don't like to do on a normal year. But you really need to work yourself out of the system for the system not to be part of your life. And an Israeli Jew who's secular will usually, as I said, practice a lot of things, but also will have a vision, I think, of what it means to be Jewish that might be very different from the other groups. And the separation which I think, and I recommend people go read the as you mentioned, the Rivlin speech. It comes from the education system. Okay, that's sort of the root of the problem, if we want to call it a problem. I think it is a problem. That we have separate, those are the four separate education, public education, pretty much public unless you're an ultra-orthodox, that's a different thing. But those are the public education systems that we go to. So when I went to my kibbutz's high school, I was there with people from other kibbutzim or moshavim in the area, really a small number of people who came from nearby cities. There just are not Arab students or religious students because they don't live here. But also, if you live in a more heterogenic city, you will probably not meet a lot of people who are not sort of sharing your religiosity level, might we call that, in a way that you will find them in other parts of the world. So I do think that that's a major problem. I will also say, and it's important when Paul and I discussed about it, we prepped for this call. I will say that one thing that I believe is important to understand about Rivlin's speech is that I think that it's much more a vision than it is a demographic reality. I will argue, and I'm arguing not on behalf of myself because I'm not a very important or smart person, but on behalf of every piece of data that I'm aware of that other people have researched and studied, we're not really on a track to be for what Rivlin describes as sort of four pretty much equal tribes anywhere in the next century or so. It's just not. There are demographic changes, but first of all, they're slowing down. And specifically, and I think that that's a specific problem in the speech, he is referring to what you would call in the States, or we call national religious, dati leumi, modern Orthodox, whatever you want to call it. There just is not a single demographic projection saying that they will be a quarter of the country. I don't know when. Not in my lifetime, probably not in my daughter's lifetime. So it was just important for me to say it because a lot of times, and I think Americans are much more aware of demographics than we are. It's a major part of a multinational, multicultural, very diverse country. We are not a very diverse country, unfortunately. A lot of people look like me and like Paul. And that's like, we're nice, but it would have been interesting to see other things. But and I want to say another word about that, because also when we are talking about demographics, I mentioned Russian-speaking Israelis. And I know that for a lot of American Jews, Russian-speaking Israelis and Russian-speaking Jews in general is something that your communities, and I refer to people here as American Jews, but I apologize if a lot of people are not. You took a major part in allowing the change, to happen, and they came to Israel in the beginning of the 90s when they left the former Soviet Union. We're talking about a group of over 1 million people who live in Israel now, which the chief rabbinate does not recognize over 400,000 of them as Jews. And that number, by the way, is growing rapidly due to two reasons. One is demographics, and the other one is Aliyah. Russia and the Ukraine are still the major pillars of Aliyah to Israel, by far greater than any other country. And usually the demographic census here will refer to 5% of the country, which is 4.8 or something of those 5% are that group as others. Okay, because the Rabbanut will not call them Jewish.
Uri, can I, for the sake of clarity, can I
Yes.
just make a point, just for those that don't know, that what Uri is referring to, which is one of the major problems here, is that there are two parallel definitions going on. There's eligibility for Aliyah under the law of return, which is for essentially anyone who has a Jewish grandparent. or is married to a Jew, actually. And then there is the definition of Jewish according to Orthodox halakha, Orthodox Jewish law, which the Rabbanut adhere to, which is only a Jewish mother or a conversion recognized by the Rabbanut. Therefore, as Uri says, a large number, I think you said 400,000 and growing, of olim, of immigrants from the former Soviet Union who came here that are not Jewish according to Jewish law. They have a Jewish father, maybe, rather than Jewish mother, or maybe even a Jewish grandparent, but not a Jewish mother, and are therefore eligible for Aliyah, eligible for Israeli citizenship, but not regarded as Jewish according to the Rabbanut. Sorry,
Right.
continue.
No, it's great. And I really think that that's, a lot of times it sort of falls off the statistics, or if it falls off the discussion, and it's a major issue here. We are now dealing, one of the things that we're doing is that we are helping someone who, it's funny, like people are calling them like new, like the title of new immigrants is something that people hold here for like a lifetime.
I'm still a new immigrant.
Yeah, when I started being the executive director of Hofsheet, someone told me, listen, you should call yourself the new director, because it like people then forgive you for stuff that you do. But we are now helping someone who is a new immigrant. He's so new that he's here for almost 30 years. And he was fired from a supermarket chain in which he worked as a chef. After the kashrut supervisor all of a sudden decided that he needs to check if he's Jewish. It made headlines. It was yesterday, I think, by both in the Jerusalem Post and in Haaretz in English. His name is Uri Lugvinenko, and it's very obvious when you talk to him. He has an accent. He's called Yuri, and the supermarket is 5 minutes away from my home. Okay, and if I was working with him, no one would have dared question my own Judaism, although my grandmother came from Russia also, and no one would have asked me in the middle of the day if I can pull out my national ID card so that the kashrut supervisor can check that if I'm Jewish or not, and no employer in their right mind would have told me that the kashrut supervisor said that I must walk away from my working space at that moment and sit in the car for a couple of days because the kashrut supervisor has issues. So I would say that it's just something that I think is very important to mention, because we're talking about a huge group that is specifically singled out by the religious institutions that we have here. And a lot of times it's just sort of overlooked.
Okay, thank you. We already have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to turn things over to those. So the first question we have is a demographic question, and it's whether you have data regarding what percentage of current secular or non-religious traditional Jews originally came from religious homes. People that left the religious community to become secular.
So it's a great question. One of the things that is mentioned in the research by Rosner and Fuchs is that they say that, again, broadly speaking, Israelis tend to be less religious than their parents. Okay, that's a very broad sentence, and it's a super simplifying figure, but we know, and a lot of times, and that I think was also one of the triggers for Rivlin's speech, is that you get a headline saying X amount of people in first grade are now either Arab or ultra-orthodox, getting to 40%, 40 something, whatever. And one of the best research that I read, and that I was very disappointed of myself that I didn't think about it, which usually happens to me when I read smart stuff, was that the Taub Center in Tel Aviv University in 2018 checked something, which is a very important phenomenon if you're trying to use first graders demographics to analyze the future. And what they said, and I think is very obvious, is that people, which is why I was upset that I didn't think about it, is that pupils don't usually stay in first grade for the rest of their lives. And if you want to check what happens, you need to check what happens over 12 years. And there you see that 20% of those who started in the ultra-orthodox system, I saw someone putting in a chat, great, I really, really recommend this book. So about 20% of people who started in the ultra-orthodox system moved to the national religious school system. Probably different 20% move from national religious to the general or secular school systems. And on the other sort of the movement to the other side is about 2%. You can analyze that from very different topics, whether it mean do certain parents enlist their children to specific schools because not only because they feel affiliated religiously, but for other reasons. That's the case for some. But generally speaking, you see a growth in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, but that's about it. You don't see any, from what I understand, any other major changes. And definitely we're talking about a change in demographics, but usually the reference that you get is much I would say overhyped when you're looking at what's actually happening.
Okay, thank you. There was a question here about Russian Olim and whether those that are not halakhically Jewish, how can they get married? How can they get married? Can they have a civil marriage?
Great question. I will start by saying that for a while, and I am happy to say that it is changing because of the people who are now referred to as generation 1.5, people who were either born here. A lot of them are around my age. I'm 36, so they were either born here or came at a very early age. We're seeing a decline, and I don't, maybe some people here won't like it, but a decline of the number of people from that group that are going through conversion, are going through giyur. And that's happening mainly because a lot of them are saying, but why should I go through a conversion? I am Jewish. I just don't need the rabbinate's stamp on my back to allow me to be Jewish. But we are talking about a group that is, if I'm diving a bit too specific, let me know, but there is a difference within the Russian-speaking Israeli group among people who the Rabbanut will not recognize as Jewish, and to a very, very, very small group of people who the country will recognize as sort of lacking a religion, which is a very weird sentence, and also a very weird question as to why does the country need to define your religion, but let's leave that aside for a second. If you are someone who is lacking a religion and your partner is lacking a religion, you will be able to civically marry in Israel. You are the only ones in the country to be able to do that. That's a law from the beginning of last decade. And to understand how popular it is, we're talking about approximately 200 couples that ever went through this process. Like, you need to be super specific, first of all, with the people you choose to fall in love with, and it's just not a thing. So the vast majority of the group that I described, was over 400,000 Russian-speaking Israelis, are blocked from legally or sort of formally marrying in the country. And what we and other organizations advise them to do is to marry here, and then hold the status of common law marriage. That is also, by the way, the status my wife and I hold at the moment. We did not marry through the Rabbanut. And the main reason that we advise couples not to go abroad, there's actually two reasons. One, with all due respect, we believe that Israelis should marry in Israel. And we do not like the fact that people need to go abroad in order to marry. We do not think that you need to be in a situation in which you risk your life for this country, but in order to get married, you need to go to Cyprus or to the Czech Republic or to great places in the US, which are great, but you just don't need to do that. And the other thing is that the Rabbanut, if you were married abroad, you need to register as married in Israel, and the country will recognize it. But if you're a Jewish heterosexual couple, or that there might be questions around your Judaism, but you might be Jewish according to the Rabbanut, maybe you're not, maybe you are, you will still divorce in the Rabbanut. So you might find yourself divorcing in the same Rabbanut that will not marry you. Yeah, great, I know. And that's why we advise couples not to put themselves in any way of harm's way. Sorry for the harsh word, and not to marry abroad, and just to stay common law married in Israel. At the moment, that is a very, very strong legal status, mainly because our courts needed to do something about it for decades and decades, because the politicians did not. So as long as we're talking about within the country, you are getting pretty much all the rights. It becomes a problem if you need to go abroad to certain places. So let's say the US State Department does not recognize that. And unfortunately, I think that they have a point. When we talked to the embassy about it, they said, listen, folks, we like you, you're nice. Your country needs to make the decision. You cannot put it on the shoulders of the State Department to ask them to recognize a ruling in Israel. It's not up to us. So that's usually the only problem, is if you need to go abroad.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very full answer. Question here about the concept of Shivyon Bernette, equality of the burden, sharing the burden, which was a slogan which was very popular a few years ago when there were protests, economic protests about certain populations, mainly the ultra-orthodox population that were accused essentially of not shouldering their share of the national burden in terms of army service, and also, of course, paying the tax burden through employment and other things. And he asks, Jeff asks, does your organization advocate for Shivyon Bernette? And if so, do you focus on both the Kharidi and the Arab communities? Of course, the Arab communities also do not, by and large, do not serve in the army.
Right. So first of all, yes, we are a part of the broader public discussion about Shivyon Bernette. I do want to say something about it. One thing that is important, I think, to remember, and I'm saying that as someone who is very proud of his army and ongoing army service, is that when we're talking about Shivyon Bernette, I think that as a country, we have broader needs that are not only army service. And if I was to describe a solution, I would say that I think it would be fine for large portions of the Israeli society, including ultra-orthodox, including Arab, to do civil service. Not everyone needs to serve in the army. I don't think that it will be a surprise to you to know that some people who serve in the army, I think, have much better ways to serve the country. I totally believe in the concept. I totally believe that everyone needs to put his own share in the game. And I think that it's important for cohesiveness. I think it's important for security. It's important for numerous reasons. I also think that in a lot of debates over that, people tend to forget other parts of the society. We're talking about a situation right now that if we're talking about religious women, they can get off an army service with just saying that they are religious. And I'm not saying that people lie about it. Some lie about it, but you will always have liars. But I do think that it's important to understand that a lot of times we're talking only about ultra-Orthodox people, and they're not the only group which is getting, or not even the only Jewish group, who's getting excluded voluntarily or in a way from the army service. And I think that that's a problem. And I definitely think that it just does not make sense. A lot of times when you're hearing sort of the public debate about it, they're talking about giyus bekfiya, sort of how would I do bekfiya? How will I translate it? Sort of that they are forcing you to enlist, and that you must not force people. And I always say, guy, like with all due respect, when I was 17, no one asked me, how do I feel about it? What do I think? And I'm fine with that. My entire family served in the IDF. I am very, very proud of everything that I did. But it was part of the game. I understood that that's the law. I need to serve. I understood the reasons. I understood why am I doing that. But I was obliged to do that. And it's fine. I just think that you shouldn't. There's in the Talmud, they're talking about, there's a saying that it's more important to do something that you're obliged to do than something that you choose to do. Gadol metzuveh ve'oseh, mishe'eino metzuveh ve'oseh. And I think that that's an important piece. It's harder to do something that you must do than something that you choose to do. And I think that everyone must put their share in a way. That just doesn't have to be the army, but something. And yes, that definitely applies to all.
Thank you very much. I'm waiting for some more questions to come in. Please write them in. I'm going to ask a question which we haven't really got into so much, which is how this plays out politically. And obviously, we know that the ultra-orthodox, the Kharidim, have two political parties. The Arabs have their these days one joint list made up of 4 different factions that have grouped together. And obviously, secular Jews, there's no secular Jewish party, not least because, as we've already said, it's an extremely diverse population, and it wouldn't really make sense to have one party that represents all Jews that call themselves secular. But I wonder if one of the obstacles to getting the changes that you want, you talked about how you've made great strides in public opinion, but there still isn't necessarily the changes in policy that you want to see. And I wonder if one of the obstacles to that is that even if there is great public support for these things, whatever 70% support for public transportation on Shabbat or civil marriage or other things like that, ultimately when elections come along, and we do have a lot of them, yes, when elections come along, that's not what people are voting about. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely fair. I will also say something that I think is important to understand. You mentioned the joint list, which is currently the political representation of the vast majority of the Arab citizens of Israel. It's important to understand that the joint list is not a liberal list. That's also something that people sometimes mix because we're talking about a minority group. The joint list it's comprising of, as you mentioned, 4 different Arab parties. One of them is a religious Muslim party, which, as you can, I would say, you will not be surprised that they are not very liberal. But also a majority of the other representatives are not people who will vote for LGBT equality in a day like today, actually. 3 hours ago, if you want to be specific. But I do think that, as I said in the beginning, I think that our work is harder mainly because even if you're secular and other things. You're secular and you're on the right. You're secular and you're on the left. You're secular and you support X economical vision. You're secular and you care a lot about other issues, about peace, about security. We have like a bunch of things here, as we all know. And that's just not a monolithic group. I do think that my job, I think that I will be worth everything that I am paid, which is not really a lot, but it's just if we are able to make that a voting issue, and that goes through even more public support, because eventually, in order to hold people accountable to their political programma or their political play or whatever you want to call it, the way that they do their politics, that just goes through more and more and more public pressure, and by more and more and more people saying, listen, I will be voting for you if you will X. And yeah, the coalition structure is very problematic, and it allows specific groups to hang on to specific powers, because they will tell you, listen, this is the only thing that I care about. But truth needs to be said, and I think that we saw it now in the days of COVID. That's not the only thing that they care about. They represent their public on a variety of issues. And I mainly think that and I think we're getting closer, it's still far, but we're getting closer to being able to reach across the aisle of other political problems here that, again, we do not lack. And being able to build cooperations among those people who do support it. Because you now, even in Likud, it's Netanyahu's party, the majority of voters support civil marriage. And the majority of voters will support public consultation on Shabbat. The numbers are there. We need to focus our work, and we focus our work on changing the ranking of what is the most important thing when you go to vote. And yes, in a country like Israel, it's hard. A lot of things are changing. A lot of things are steady but important, like security. And I do think that is the keystone to our success. When we saw that, by the way, on the local level, when you saw that the first mayors just said, listen, we're doing public consultation on Shabbat. We will pay for the buses to run on Shabbat. And it's important, by the way, to note that the buses that are running on Shabbat are free of charge, because legally the municipalities can't charge money on Shabbat for buses. It's a not important thing, but they're paying for that, and it's a free service, and the buses are packed. So I definitely think that we're getting there, and reaching across the aisle is extremely important, probably the most strategic thing we can do, and gathering more and more public support.
Right, thank you very much. I think a good illustration of what you're talking about with regard to the coalition system and how it is problematic or difficult for people doing what you're trying to do is that, right now in the current political situation, Netanyahu's most reliable supporters are the two Kharidi parties, right? They're the two parties that are sticking by him, even when other parties, like other right-wing parties, are not sticking by him. I mean, Naftali Bennett's party there's a big rift there. They're not in the coalition. We now have another right-wing party just started yesterday from Gideon Sa'ar from the Likud, which may or may not be willing to support a Netanyahu government, but he can rely on the two Haredi parties. So if you're a Likud voter who supports all the things that you're talking about, then you have to, you're voting Likud because you want a Likud-led government, you want Netanyahu as prime minister, but you'll have to stomach the coalition partners that you don't want. That's just the way it is, right?
Yeah, that's a great description. I think, by the way, that's one of Netanyahu. Either you like him or not, there isn't a person I think knows the guts and wrenches of our society better than him, and he is getting elected because of that, and I think that's just a fact. And yeah, you also are in a position in which you need to have they used to refer to the ultra-orthodox sort of the swing vote between governments. They can go with the left, they can go with the right. That's no longer the case. Maybe it will be different when Netanyahu is not in the arena anymore. If someday that will happen.
Whenever that is.
Yeah, maybe just an idea. But but I'm not sure about that, because I think that the Republic is, generally speaking, on the right, and that they are the most conservative party in the sphere. And yeah, I do think that also what Netanyahu does understand, that then they also understand in some parts of that, is that being with them on the same side also has a political price tag, and that Netanyahu is sometimes not able, and they are also probably the most smart politicians in the country. They are also not pushing him too far. They understand that sort of him being seen as caving in to ultra-orthodox demands is politically toxic in ways that there are just not a lot of issues that are. We also saw that in COVID. We're seeing that on a lot of issues. They have some kind of an equilibrium which works for them for a while now. And when that equilibrium broke in 2013, we had a different government. Netanyahu understood that that's just not something that is sustainable, and sort of matched them back into his government. And yeah, I just think that they are playing the best hand that they have with their cards, and that I hope that other politicians were as successful in representing the Republic as the ultra-orthodox politicians.
Okay. Thank you very much, Uri. I think we're going to finish there. We don't seem to have any more questions. We've been going for an hour. So Uri, I want to thank you very, very much for your time, and for starting us off with this series. Obviously, there's a lot more that could be said, and as Uri has recommended a couple of times, Shmuel Rosner's book is excellent. Uri's written his email down in the chat, uri@befree.org.il. You can see it there. My email, paulg@begincenter.org.il. Email me if you want to be on my mailing list. You can also find out what we're doing from our English website and our Facebook page. Next week, if you're curious about getting the ultra-orthodox perspective on some of the things that we've just been talking about, given that we were just talking about the ultra-orthodox, you could do that next week when we have a speaker from the Kharidi community. So I hope to see you all there next week. Thank you again, Uri, very much for your time and your contribution and your insights. And I wish everyone a good day or good evening and a Chag Hanukkah Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.